Hello, confirmation students. Pastor Jesse here with session number 5, the Exodus. As far as background information, Exodus is the central story of the Old Testament, the grounding for how the chosen people of God come to understand who they are and who their God is. It's easy to reduce Exodus to a story of Pharaoh and Moses, the Israelites and the Egyptians, but the story is really about God. In many ways, this story is epic. There is slavery, murder, kings and kingdoms, a bush that bursts into flame without being consumed, bizarre plagues of frogs, flies, locusts, and boils strike the land. At the heart of it all, God's faithfulness to God's people is what is really key. God keeping the promises that they have not been forgotten and that God will continue to be their God. God will not stand for injustice and suffering. God hears the cries of his people and takes action. Oddly enough, God takes action through Moses, a Hebrew raised among royalty, a murderer who has fled to Midian for sanctuary, a stutterer, and a slightly doubtful man. Moses becomes God's great leader, bringing the word of God against Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And bizarrely, it works. At the edge of the Red Sea, the people of God, once enslaved, celebrate their freedom and their promise of a land just for them, the Promised Land. Even more bizarre, almost as soon as their songs of praise have faded, God's people start forgetting the great and mighty acts of God performed to save them. They complain and they want to turn back. They let themselves be captivated by powerless idols, but their unfaithfulness cannot undo God's faithfulness. At Mount Sinai and in the wilderness, they will be taught over and over again what it means to be the people of God. What you need to know. The first part of Exodus declares who God is. God calls to Moses from the burning bush and declares, "I am who I am." Throughout the history and throughout the story, God demonstrates what that means. God hears, listens, considers, and then acts. God is not far off, but it is intimately concerned with how we are treated and whether we are allowed to live the full life given us at creation. And if we are not, well, then God does not stand for oppression. Violent rulers and brutal treatment do not make God back down. God will act to save. The second part of Exodus teaches that what it means to be God's people. God gets the people out of slavery, but then must get the slavery out of the people. They have become accustomed to the ways of Egypt. They think power is the sign of who is on top. They believe that any idol will be suitable for their worship. And they whine that it would have been better to live as well-fed slaves than to die free in the desert, even though God is providing the food and the water and the safety that they need. God works through signs, miracles, and finally through commandments given at Sinai to teach the people how to live as God's people, to be faithful, to be just, and to be merciful. We can forget, but God remembers. Like the Israelites at the foot of Mount Sinai worshiping a golden calf, yes, a golden calf, you'll be curious to read that story. We may forget who God is and what God has done for us. We may grumble or complain or even struggle to believe that God is at work at all. None of this negates God's promises. God doesn't choose the Israelites or us because of our faith, but because of God's faith. God's faithfulness does not depend on our acknowledgement. This is why we remember the story of Exodus in the baptismal liturgy. Just as God promised to be with the Israelites at the sea simply because God was faithful, so has God promised to be with us in our baptism and beyond. God has a hand out to us. Nothing can ever change that. Exodus is a story that calls for response. It's an epic tale of a suffering people whose cries God heard and responded to. But while God could act alone, God chooses to invite people to respond in trust that they will be led to where they need to go. Problems often begin for people when they start to take charge of the story. They are invited to live within it, but they are charged to remember the God who has brought them out of Egypt. Responding to the freedom God gives us means learning to live in faithfulness and in community, something the people of God are constantly working on. But no matter how often we struggle, God's promises remain. Now, about the Lutheran Study Bible, the introduction to Exodus is found beginning on page 124 in the front of the Lutheran Study Bible. Please read the articles entitled Background File, What's the Story, and What's the Message. These articles can be found at the beginning of every book of the Bible and are helpful in getting a basic understanding of each book's content. Now, into the story. You will recall from session 4, Genesis, that it concluded with Joseph and his family settling in Egypt, where Joseph had found favor with Pharaoh. In Exodus 1, we hear the story of how, over time, the prosperity of the Israelites, the name given to the descendants of Israel, the father of Joseph, became a burden that threatened the Egyptians. And so, with the memory of Joseph well in the past, Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites. It was a bitter life for the Israelites, but the God of their ancestors was watching and listening. God chose to liberate the Israelites by raising up a leader for them. That leader was Moses, and his story from his birth to his death has become an important story for Jews and Christians to the present day. Moses' life was blessed and cursed. His parents gave him up as a baby in order to save him from death. You can read the story about him being put in a little wicker basket and sent down the Nile River. He was raised by daughters of Pharaoh and became a prince of Egypt. Maybe you watched the cartoon when you were a little kid entitled The Prince of Egypt. That's the story of Moses. Later, as an adult, Moses betrayed his Egyptian upbringing and returned to his humble Israelite roots. That is where God found him and told him that God was aware of the struggle and hard life of the Israelites under the slavery to the Egyptians. And God was going to use him, Moses, to set God's people free. Throughout the story of Exodus, the Israelites stumble and fall, metaphorically speaking, and God accepts their confession and forgives them. There's often some kind of penance to be done, but God takes them back eventually. It's a great story full of drama and action and violence, but also grace, and of course, God prevails in the end. This story is more than a story of antiquity, it is also our story. None of us are owed anything by God, and yet God called us at our baptism and asks for our faithfulness. Though we try, the call of self-centeredness is also a strong call, one that we prefer to answer more times than not. God hears us when we cry out. This is a significant statement. It's not unfaithful to cry out to God, to lament, to complain, to express anger and hurt. God hears. Maybe you've experienced hurt and pain of human existence. You're not alone. God listens to people. Few human rulers, like Pharaoh, listen to their people. A true God and true ruler is one who cares for the people and seeks to free them from what holds them captive. Now, here are the essay questions. In your own words, briefly explain the 3 questions below. So these are not 100 to 150 word questions. These are just questions that I would like you to explain to the best of your ability. There are 3 of them. You have to do all 3. The first one, in Exodus, the slavery to the Egyptians becomes a metaphor in the New Testament for the Christians' slavery to sin. Explain how slavery to the Egyptians is similar to our slavery to sin. Number two, Moses is far from a perfect leader, not a superhero that Hollywood would have designed. Why do you suppose that is? And was his God's choice effective? And what does this mean for us? And number three, when we read the story of Exodus in its totality, we likely will come to the conclusion that the story is a mess. The Israelites are faithless and turn their backs on God again and again. It could be said that the story is important for us because we are just like the Israelites. Do you agree? Or do you disagree? And why? Then I have 6 major stories or themes from the book of Exodus listed, and I would like for you to pick 3 of them and in your own words answer the following essay questions. So, the first one is Moses. Read Exodus chapter 2 verses 1 to chapter 6 verse 13. Yes, these are larger readings. Exodus 2 to Exodus chapter 6:13. And in 100 to 150 words, summarize Moses' life up until the Exodus becomes a reality. That's when the people actually leave Egypt. Number 5, the 10 plagues. Read Exodus 7:1 through chapter 11, verse 10. And in 100 to 150 words, explain the purpose of the 10 plagues of Egypt. Number 6, the Passover. Read Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 to 28, and in 100 to 150 words, explain the institution of the Passover and why it is to be observed by Jews even today. Number 7, the Exodus itself. Read Exodus chapter 14, verse 1 through chapter 17, verse 16, and in 100 to 150 words, explain the significance of this passage. Number 8, the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. Read Exodus chapter 25, verses 10 to 22, and chapter 26, verse 1 to chapter 27, verse 21. And then, in 100 to 150 words, explain the purpose of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant that was supposed to be kept in it. The tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. And finally, number 9, the golden calf. You're going to love this story. Read Exodus chapter 31, verse 18 to Exodus 32, verse 35. And in 100 to 150 words, explain the sin of the Israelites, what Moses made the people do, and what God said God would do because of their sin. So, you have the first 3 questions that you were supposed to answer briefly, all 3, and then you can pick 3 of the next 6 major stories and write 100 to 150 words on each one. Get those back to me by Sunday, October the 18th. God bless you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.